Good evening, History of Christianity students. This is the next of the 3 recorded lectures under the general auspices of Lecture 5. We're sitting in the firelit shack again, so it's time to talk about issues of interest to the history of Christianity, and in this case we're going to get into the question of the later persecutions, when the persecution of Christians truly became a widespread, even universal phenomenon. The 3rd century is when things really heat up. It's a time of political and military turmoil. This is often forgotten in the popular memory, in my experience, of students and even professors who don't deal with history directly. There's an image of the 3rd century or the first centuries of the Christian movement as kind of a strong era for pagan Rome in which the Christian movement grows and eventually becomes a threat. What is lost from the story frequently is the type of crisis that Rome was facing in the 3rd century. Some details of this are in the textbook. There are military losses at the middle of the 3rd century on both the eastern border, the border with Persia, and the northern border, the border with the Germanic tribes, which really shake the confidence of the Roman populace in the government's ability to do what the government was supposed to do best, defend the borders. There's also a concomitant economic crisis that goes along with this, so that by the end of the 3rd century, inflation had taken its toll, and Roman currency, Roman coins, were not permissible to pay Roman taxes with. In other words, the currency had become so debased, so worthless, that the government wouldn't even take their own currency in payment for taxes. You had to pay in actual grain or livestock or whatever else you had by the way of real goods, because money didn't do it anymore. This is the typical crisis of spiraling inflation that comes from a debased currency if you're into the economic side of things. On the spiritual side, this meant that there was a certain recurring crisis for the Christians, as Rome went through periods in which demonstrations of the loyalty of her own citizens were mandated by the emperors. If you're losing on the frontiers, it's time for the citizens to demonstrate that they are still behind the spiritual power that is Rome. And this has to be done through sacrifices. So, mandates for sacrifice to the imperial cult begin in the middle of the 3rd century, and that's when the first universal persecutions also begin. The Christian refusal to take part in the sacrifices led to a popular mistrust of the Christian minority throughout the empire. And when a popular revolt against the Christians breaks out in Alexandria, it becomes the occasion for the Emperor Decius to institute the first policy of a universal persecution of the Christians. Under Decius, who reigned not even 2 years, from 249 to 251 CE, the uprising in Alexandria, as I just said, led to the first universal persecution of Christians in the empire. Note that as we talk about persecutions, that does not happen until Decius. This is the first time that this becomes an official policy of the empire. Decius particularly targeted church leaders, the clergy, bishops, priests, and deacons, as a way of decapitating the Christian movement and encouraging others to bind themselves to Rome through sacrifice. And he made it as easy as he could. All you had to do, if you had been accused of being a Christian, was throw a few grains of incense onto the fire before one of the pagan gods, one of the pagan altars, didn't really even matter which in most cases, and demonstrate that you were not a Christian. Couldn't be easier. If you did this, you received a certificate that said you sacrificed. Therefore, if they're hunting down Christians again, and you can produce one of these certificates, which is called a labelli, or a labellus, labelli would be plural, a labellus, that would demonstrate, obviously, you had already paid your taxes. In other words, you'd already given at the office, sacrificed to a god, and obviously no Christian would do that, so you must be free of guilt. The thought was that this would simply bring Christians back in line with a more rational, as Rome saw it, attitude toward offering to Rome. It didn't work. Many, and not most, Christians, especially the non-leaders, found this an easy policy to work with. What harm can it do? You spare the life of your family, and you don't have to mean it. All you have to do is drop a few grains of incense on the fire. Well, if that's too much for you, there are plenty of shady people in Rome, some of whom may be, sanctioned to do so secretly by the powers that be, who would sell you a certificate that simply said you sacrificed, in which case you could go about your business, having not truly broken your vows to the Lord, and if anyone asked, you could show your certificate that said you sacrificed even though you didn't. Now, most Christians didn't do this, but enough did that it became a problem in the Christian movement. How many, what percentage, I have no idea. I suspect, actually, a true minority. I mean, I'd be surprised if more than 20% of Christians ever went this far. From the way things are discussed in the texts, and that's probably a high number. Nevertheless, it's a significant enough group of people that in various parts of the empire a controversy arises over the Christians who may have done this and then later regretted what they did. This led to a fierce debate. Should such people, called the lapsi, be let back into the Christian community, and under what terms? After all, they had done what the martyrs had not. They had betrayed the faith, in however mild and innocuous a fashion. Given the choice of standing up for the gospel, which they'd sworn their lives to, they backed down. Maybe it's a few grains of incense on an altar, maybe it's just buying a certificate, but that is not what is described in the Gospels, and in the Gospel of Mark as you read it, as bearing your cross. That is not confessing Christ before men. That is backing down from the confession, backing down from the witness to which all Christians are called. Should such people be let back into the Christian community? If so, how? After all, they betrayed the faith. They are, in whatever degree, traitors. A second wave of even more vicious universal persecutions began in 257 and 258 under Decius' successor, Valerian. I sometimes get questions on the pronunciation of things like C's and V's in Latin. The proper pronunciation is always a hard C, though since we are in the habit of speaking English, we call emperors like Decius, we usually call him Decius or Decius. That's simply the way English-speaking people pronounce the name. The Latin would be Decius, but since that throws a lot of people, I kind of go back and forth. Valerian follows Decius. There's an interesting phenomenon that should be noted here. The emperors who perpetrate these widespread persecutions tend to come to very bad ends. Decius is in the north fighting against the Goths, and he winds up captured by the Goths and being slowly tortured to death. While, we could just think of this as a usual episode of Germans behaving badly, to the Roman mind, this had spiritual significance. And you'll notice Valerian doesn't continue right away the persecution of Christians. He gives it some time. He isn't sure exactly what spiritual problems or governmental problems, what combination of spiritual and physical problems led to Decius being captured and tortured to death, but he's not interested in a policy that's going to do the same thing. This is one explanation, anyway, for why Valerian stops the persecution of Christians, but then starts a far more vicious one, because he certainly, things aren't getting better in the Roman Empire, and he certainly isn't convinced that the Christians should be spared when they aren't being loyal to the empire. The empire's fighting on two fronts. and they're losing. So eventually Valerian begins another persecution in 257 and 258. Upon the death of Valerian, Gallienus, the next emperor, revoked the edict against Christians, and 44 years of pretty much relative peace ensued. This doesn't mean that there were no martyrs, but it went back to being a local thing by and large. Partly this is because the emperors after Valerian were far too distracted with actual warfare and economic crisis, and, for that matter, killing one another. Most did not die natural deaths, and there's a rapid succession of emperors. The Christians weren't on their radar. The other issue, which comes back to haunt the emperors, is that Valerian, the last real persecutor of Christians in the mid-3rd century, also has a nasty fate. He is fighting on the Persian border. Okay, Decius was captured and tortured on the German border in the north. Valerian is fighting on the Persian border, and he's made a prisoner by Shapur II, a Persian king and warlord. Now, frequently there's the story simply ends there, is because as you're reading common histories of Christianity, the Roman emperors only figure in insofar as they participated in things like persecution. But Valerian's death also was nasty. Shapur II turned him into a footstool. In other words, when Shapur sat down and wanted to put up his feet, the Roman Emperor Valerian crawled over, having been maimed earlier by Shapur. He crawled over and became the footstool whenever Shapur wanted to put his feet up after a long day of conquest and pillage. Valerian eventually died under this treatment because he wasn't treated well otherwise, but this too had something of an impact upon the emperors that followed. If it had an impact upon the emperors that followed, it also was not lost on the Christians that when emperors started nasty persecutions, they tended to die nasty deaths. So this tidbit, coincidental as we may think it as historically minded people, this tidbit of information as it was passed around the Christian communities convinced them that God was getting his retribution on the Roman emperors. Behind the anti-Christian sentiment in the empire was more than mere patriotic frustration with those who refused to sacrifice. There is a genuine crisis in the old system of the gods that we saw beginning even at the time of Justin the Martyr and earlier, but now it's hit a peak. The founding concepts of the various pagan religions, and particularly the central pagan religion of the Greco-Roman world, that Zeus, Jupiter kind of pantheon, this was really falling out of popular favor, along with the concepts that supported it. On the one hand, the traditional gods of Rome were not apparently working, since the enemies of Rome were gaining ground on all sides. Perhaps this is because too many people have drifted from those gods, and the literal power base of the old gods is gone. People were moving on to philosophical schools, they were moving into mystery religions, and of course Judaism and Christianity were making their converts as well. On the other hand, more philosophical citizens, as we saw with Justin the Martyr, had always steered away from the popular gods, thinking that they were just kind of low-level spiritual powers, and their objections were gaining force in the general population, kind of the trickle-down effect of intellectual movements, which is fairly typical in intellectual history. The upper crust of society at the time of Justin Martyr doesn't really believe in or trust the old gods, and eventually this becomes the position also of the more general populace. They are going after other answers, whether it's philosophy. A trend called Neoplatonism arises at this time, which consolidates and systematizes some of the wandering thoughts of Middle Platonism and returns to some of the core issues that Plato himself advocated. So you have a philosophical movement gaining popular ground, and you have mystery cults and monotheistic religions, not just Christianity and Judaism, but other types of monotheism, which are also gaining ground in the 3rd century. People are turning toward new gods since the old ones have failed. There's a real sense among all, then, that some type of alternatives were needed. Middle Platonism evolved into Neoplatonism, and the key name with that, Plotinus, and his disciple Porphyry, are the two real movers and shakers behind this transition to what we now call Neoplatonism. And one of the features of Neoplatonism was the sun as a symbol for the first principle, or the one transcendent God. It was a unifying feature of the Neoplatonists, the role of light and the role of the sun as a symbol of the transcendent God as opposed to the lesser spiritual powers. This coincides with a general fanaticism that crosses all cultic lines about the symbolism of the sun. Now, the sun as a symbol of divinity was there in Judaism and Christianity long before Rome has this fanatic interest in sun worship. Elagabalus, the emperor, in the 220s, who was a Syrian, hence the catchy name Elagabalus. Elagabalus was a worshipper of a monotheistic god who was symbolized by the sun, and the idea was that sun symbolism could somehow unite the empire. It's found in every religion. Therefore, let's gather around what all religions agree on: the sun is a symbol of divinity. And this bleeds over, or is fueled by, depending on how you want to look at the causation, the rise of Neoplatonism, which has a high premium on the idea of the sun as a symbol for the nous. This is also representative of a more general shift away from all types of polytheism among the pagan population. One increasingly popular alternative, for men anyway, since women were not allowed to join the cult, was the monotheistic cult of Mithras, a mystery religion which had begun in Persia, and which advocated an ethical life of loyalty and virtue, as well as self-control, which was, in its focus, reminiscent of the philosophical schools. It's kind of a philosophical school with a lot more cool sacrifices and cultic elements, borrowed initially from Persia. When Mithraism moved west, however, it picked up an awful lot of other ideas, including ideas from Judaism and Christianity. It was truly syncretistic. It borrowed from everything it found. It also picked up ideas in the 3rd century from Neoplatonism. So Mithraism, far from being a clean, tidy, unified religion, as some people like Manfred Klaus, who wrote a book on Mithraism, tend to portray it, Mithraism was a real hodgepodge. And it's symbolic, I think, or emblematic of the types of religions to which people were turning. It's also interesting that although Mithraism existed in the Roman Empire since the 1st century at least, and it is just continuing into the 3rd century, that it is Persian. And this doesn't seem to be a problem. After all, the Persian gods seem to be working, as Valerian's defeat and capture and slow, nasty death seem to prove. And Mithraism is also very common among the Roman military. So Mithraism has a kind of a privileged place in the mid-3rd century. The new trend in paganism with the most potential, once it developed, was the monotheistic cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, in which the rule of the supreme transcendent God was seen symbolically represented by the sun, as we talked about on the last slide, the god Apollo. The temples to Apollo and worship of Apollo really increases at the same time that worship of the other gods of the pantheon are decreasing. But he is the sun god, so he must be symbolic of the transcendent God as well. And the rule of the emperor himself as the sole sun, if you will, S-U-N, the life-giving, light-giving focus of the empire. So the idea of this particular kind of generic monotheism everybody agrees that the sun's a symbol of divinity. The sun also symbolizes Rome. This should have the potential to unite the empire, or so certain emperors think. December 25th, essentially the solstice, was designated as the feast day for the new cult. December 25th, of course, isn't the solstice, but it was kind of the official day of the solstice because, after all, who has the time to sit down and measure how much daylight there is anyway? The measuring instruments aren't common. They require an awful lot of technical knowledge. So December 25th was assumed to be the solstice. But this was not done. There's a lot of discussion about Sol Invictus. This was not done until the year 274. By this time, it's likely that Christians, at least in the West, had already been worshipping on this day as the feast of the Nativity of Christ. There's a lot of different theories about this, but I do want to point out that the idea that somehow Christians picked up a pagan holiday could very well be reversed. I'm not sure there's any way you can say that that's true. Christians weren't interested in worshiping on pagan holidays. But it could very well be that the Emperor Aurelian, who decreed the 25th an official holiday, was doing so because Christians, in their increasing numbers, were already worshiping on that day. This would have been a way to incorporate Christians into the general worship of the sun. A more unified empire would be the result if Christians and Jews could be incorporated into this kind of general agreement that the sun was a symbol of God. One of the most attractive features was how well this pagan trend of sun worship meshed with the current cutting edge of philosophy, Neoplatonism. And as I had mentioned on the last slide, it's hard to say which fueled which, but there's a kind of, it's the best way I think to think of it is interactive. There's an increasing dedication to monotheism with the sun as the symbol of the one God that coincides with Neoplatonism, that coincides with kind of a cultural upsurge in Christians who had been for some time apparently worshiping at the solstice. The return of the light is the time to celebrate the coming of Jesus Christ. All of these things overlap in kind of a cultural phenomenon of worshiping with the sun as the symbol of the ultimate divinity. In spite of its potential, Sol Invictus did not unite the empire. Another option was Manichaeanism, which, like Mithraism, was imported from Persia. And do check out Manichaeanism in the book. This is what I think the Gospel of Thomas was. Manichaeanism is a dualistic religion named for its founder, Mani, and it claimed to be a universal religion which could, bring all peoples together under universal truths. Many religions make this claim, including, say, Judaism and Christianity. But this was marked by things that weren't so typical of Judaism and Christianity. Syncretism, like Mithraism, Manichaeanism incorporated other religious ideas, and especially borrowed symbolism and stories from Judaism and Christianity. This is what I think the Gospel of Thomas is. It is a Manichaean adoption of Christian ideas into a dualistic, that means, of course, good versus evil, fighting in some type of cosmic battle, dualistic system. Their dualism was really quite radical. This is what I believe you were seeing in reading the Gospel of Thomas. Light and dark are two forces constantly contending in the universe, and eventually these two forces would form some type of synthesis that would occur at the end of time. That is very much what's going on with that weird discussion of gender, not the last verse in the Gospel of Thomas. That's just straight up Aristotelian bigotry against women. But the other points where the male and the female are in conflict and then they become one, the female is the male is the female, all this stuff going on in the Gospel of Thomas, I think is pretty typical of this yin and yang focus of Manichaeanism. And it had also a Gnostic-like belief in the inner circle of chosen initiates as being the ones who truly know, but it wasn't exclusive. And this made Manichaeanism extremely popular in the general public because, unlike Gnosticism generally, where you're locked into one of the three spiritual estates, in Manichaeanism you could move upward, but through greater experience of enlightenment and by practicing the Manichaean disciplines more rigorously, most of which involve denial, asceticism, celibacy, a reduction in the types and amount of food eaten. All of this is part of this typical furniture of truly spiritual people as they were seen in the late Roman Empire. The bottom line in all of this, and that shouldn't be under Manichaeanism, but the bottom line in all of this is that there are many different systems competing for adherents. Christianity is one of them that's drawing an awful lot of new converts in spite of the universal persecutions under Decius and Valerian at the time. In the years of peace after Valerian, Christianity grows considerably. How much I don't know, but it is noted throughout the texts of the time, and this is where Christianity unquestionably becomes part of the landscape of the Roman Empire. Nobody's going to deny that the Christians are a significant movement now. This is because it's another alternative that appealed to dissatisfied pagans. It matches the trend toward monotheism. It's a monotheistic religion. It seems like a great viable alternative as you're weighing different monotheistic possibilities, as following the social trend of breaking away from the old pantheon. There is kind of a cultural assumption that exists among the general population in America and Europe that, until they study history, that somehow the Roman gods were just kind of the Roman gods all the way through the Roman period, and this reality that the old pantheon didn't last very long in the imperial period is often forgotten. So religion is changing anyway. Christianity is one of the alternatives, and many take it. The fact that Christianity fit the bill of philosophy and could appeal to those searching for a deeper, more philosophically oriented belief system, and that it fit the trend toward monotheism so well, contributed to an increased tension between Christianity and paganism. In previous generations, in spite of what Justin Martyr may have thought or accomplished, Christianity was not considered a real competitor, except in various times and places. Now it becomes a competitor with the philosophical schools and with mainline trends in pagan monotheism. The problem is Christianity, unlike the other trends, is still not a legal religion, and it still won't sacrifice for the good of Rome. Pagan philosophers now had to explain, and had to take great time to do so, why Christianity was not a viable alternative. There may have been some go-rounds before, in the age of the apologists, particularly with folks like Justin taking on their pagan audiences. Now pagans are taking the attack right back, and fierce debates between pagans and Christians, if also good-natured. I don't think anyone was really serious about the threats that occasionally wind up in the debates going both directions. But the pagans are willing to make an argument, make a debate with what they consider a dangerous threat to their own philosophical systems. Keep in mind, once again, that there's no such thing as a unified definition of paganism. What you see is an awful lot of folks simply reacting to and trying to debunk this new upstart in the philosophical marketplace, as it's seen. The officials of Rome recognized that there was an intellectual attraction to Christianity which they felt was unhealthy. Christians still refuse to join in the patriotic sacrifices for the good of emperor and empire. And even if you're one of the philosophical folks who believes increasingly that these sacrifices do no good, they don't actually give more power to the gods, as was thought in generations past, they're still a symbol of dedication. It's a bit like saying the Pledge of Allegiance. If you're not going to do it, why? It doesn't cost you anything, it doesn't take anything. Under Decius, the Romans would even supply the incense that you had to sacrifice before the pagan gods. All you had to do was demonstrate your loyalty to Rome by throwing that incense on the fire in front of an idol. Christians won't do this. This is considered bizarre by the Roman governing officials. During the years of peace, however, Christianity grew during the 3rd century until it was a ubiquitous minority in every territory, every province, and every level of society, up to the emperor's own household. Though a nuisance and very suspect, Christianity was spreading everywhere. Never a majority at this time. Maybe possibly 20% of the population in some provinces would be Christian or Christian-leaning. There's that as well, people who aren't quite in the camp but are hanging out at the churches. And they're noticeable by the end of the 3rd century. The organization of the Christian communities also evolved into a more complex hierarchy. With more people, you have to have a greater administrative structure, and the churches also became major property holders at this time. That's something that's often forgotten or ignored as well, is that although not technically a legal religion, if nobody's trying to stop it, and if nobody's seizing the property and taking it away from the Christians, the churches themselves amass property. They own their buildings, they own sometimes buildings next to their buildings, and have that real estate identity within the Roman society, which is usually associated with established institutions. As the textbook recognizes, this may more have been a result of the distraction of Rome than anything else. Tolerance of Christians during this period may well have had more to do with the pressure of outside concerns for the empire, crashing economy, war on two fronts off and on, emperors killing each other, than with any desire to live peaceably. But the fact is, nobody had time to slow down or quell the growth of Christianity, and so it grew, and it consolidated, and it gained property, and it became a power within secular society in the Roman world. When the opportunity presented itself, however, and an emperor powerful enough to resume persecutions came to the throne, persecution returned in force. By far the fiercest persecutions in the early centuries of Christianity came just before Christianity became a legal or a legally accepted, a licit religion as opposed to the illicit religion it had been. Persecution began again after more than 4 decades of peace as far as the Christians were concerned, not as far as the empire was concerned. The empire was in a tailspin as far as politics and war on the borders went, until Diocletian came to power in the 380s. The reign of Diocletian is a reign of reform, and often his position as a persecutor of the most vicious, or the originator of the most vicious period of persecution against the Christians, overshadows what he was up against at the end of the 3rd century and what he actually accomplished. This is in no way to suggest that he would be a great fellow to go and have a beer with. First of all, he didn't drink beer, he drank wine. Second, Diocletian had a habit of thinking rather highly of himself. He instituted the policy when you entered his presence that you had to be looking at the ground, preferably crawling on it, and when you referred to him, if you were allowed to refer to him at all, he was to be referred to as my Lord and my God. Diocletian took the title Lord and God, so not exactly suffering from humility, among what other flaws he may have. Diocletian, however, was a very intelligent general, and emperor when he got to the throne, who understood that something had to change. In the previous 50 years, Rome had gone through emperors faster than some folks change their socks, and he wanted to stay on the throne a little longer, and he did. He spent 2 decades on the throne before he retired in 305, but that's still to come. What was he faced with? He was faced with the need to reform something or the empire would collapse. And he began with reforms which were political in nature, political and economic really, as a way of streamlining the government and broadening the power base. One of the problems Diocletian faced, this is one of those periods in the course where I tend to go on tangents, and this is going to be one, let me warn you. One of the problems Diocletian faced was the out-of-control inflation as a result of the debasing of the currency, so he reeled everything in and started over with a new gold coin, which would again be changed by Constantine after him. But the idea was to put the economy on a stable base of currency again, and use a currency that had real market value, and that's what he did. The other thing he did, which was really, for the time, quite smart, historians have debated it since because it turned out to result in civil war, but hey, at the time when you're facing the complete annihilation of the empire, or potentially so, and you have had no shortage of civil wars anyway, I want to point out that it's a policy that probably, even though the policy itself didn't wind up working, adopting the policy probably saved Diocletian's life, and it probably put the empire on a political footing which would allow it to continue for another century and a half, 2 centuries in the West, and for another 1,000 years in the East. The policy was called the Tetrarchy. The problem with being emperor is that you were an automatic target if you were emperor. You were a target for the Goths or the Persians, as we saw with Decius and Valerian, or you were a target for your fellow Romans, a target for assassination and replacement. Now, by instituting the Tetrarchy, or as it's called, the Rule of Four, Diocletian made a move that probably prevented this continuous cycle of death of emperors from occurring to him. The idea was to split the empire into 2 or more. It was never quite as tidy affair as we historians like to make it sound when we're summarizing things. But there would be an eastern half and a western half. Each half would have a supreme ruler called an Augustus. He just took the names of Caesar Augustus and split them, so each half, eastern and western, would have an Augustus. One of the problems that had been perennial in the decades before Diocletian was the fact that the empire was simply too large for any one emperor, given the time it takes to communicate across so vast a space when all you have to communicate with is horses and either memorized or written messages. It's too large to govern that way. By splitting it into 2 bureaucratic halves, each half had a supreme ruler, an Augustus, although the sense was that Diocletian was the ultimate Augustus. He made that clear to Maximian, his western counterpart, and underneath them would be the emperor in waiting. So instead of waiting for the army to determine who's going to take over the job with a dagger thrust or an ill-timed feint from battle, the next Augustus was already in line, and that person held a lower rank, was kind of the vice emperor in East and West, and those were called Caesars. So at the top you had an Augustus of the East, Diocletian, and an Augustus of the West, Maximian, and beneath them you had 2 Caesars, a man by the name of Galerius in the East, and in the West was a fellow by the name of Constantius Chlorus. Chlorus is a nickname, Constantius the Pale. You think Clorox, what does Clorox do? It's a bleach. We get the name from Chlorus, Pale One. Yeah, hey, all kinds of things you learn here that you'd never find out in any other class on campus, I'm pretty sure. By 303, however, cutting off that tangent, but it's important to know a little bit about the Tetrarchy, even for this course. In History of Byzantium, we talk a lot more about it, if I ever get to teach that course again with my schedule. By 303, however, the perennial problem of satisfying the gods, at least the populace had this issue in their sights. The satisfying the gods reared its head, and Christians were blamed for the continued dissatisfaction of the Roman gods with the empire. That's at least how the story comes down to us. I think, boy, this is a decade or 2 decades where the history is very hard to unravel. Ironically, since so much has been written about it, we're pretty sure that almost none of it is particularly accurate. Sometimes almost nothing has been written about an era, but archaeology and corroborating evidence suggests that almost nothing we know is right. Here, so much has been written that we are sure is wrong, that sorting out the decades is a bit tough. Whatever the reason, in 303, the persecution of Christians began again. And this produced the most severe and rigorous persecution of the Roman Empire. Churches were to be destroyed, including a massive new cathedral in the town of Nicomedia. If you were wondering about how underground the churches were, they couldn't have been too underground in 303 if they had built a cathedral in the town of, or the city really, it's not just a town, of Nicomedia. There are a number of legends about how those Christians died. Having the entire church burned around them as they worshipped is perhaps the most colorful and also quite possibly the most accurate. So churches were to be destroyed. Sacred books were to be confiscated. Clergy were to be imprisoned and forced to sacrifice or killed. Or they also used clergy families as a way of holding the clergy hostage and forcing them to sacrifice, or they would kill the family. Lovely little Roman habit, that. In 304, less than a year into the persecution, the last requirement that all Christians would be forced to sacrifice to Rome or to the emperor was applied to every Christian. Now, whatever else was going on, I can't help but think that Diocletian's megalomania, by which he names himself Lord and God, has as much to do with this concept of sacrifice as anything else. To be honest, Diocletian had done a pretty good job of putting things back on a stable setting after, decades of mismanagement by previous emperors. So it's hard for me to buy the idea that it's simply the continued bad fate of Rome that leads to this persecution. I'm more inclined to think that Diocletian himself and his megalomaniac personality had a lot to do with it. Whatever the case may be, now is when we have the type of persecution that you've all been waiting for. A universal persecution where a Christian must either sacrifice or be sacrificed. In 305, Diocletian resigned his office due to poor health and retired to a lovely little place in the Dalmatian coast, what would become Yugoslavia, and now it's the town of Split, and I think that's Croatia. Boy, my off the top of my head memory of the Adriatic is not what it should be right now. Too many football statistics have taken place, but in any case, the town is now called Split, and I'm not going to stop and look it up just for the sake of this lecture to see what country it's in after Yugoslavia split up. Dates me when I still talk about it as Yugoslavia, I guess. The fact that Diocletian resigned according to poor health was at least that, of course, that comes from Christian sources, and that concept was not lost on Christians. See, God is not favorable to what Diocletian's doing. Also not lost on Christians was the arrogant claim to be Lord and God. That is, after all, very similar to what Thomas says to Jesus when he puts his hand in his side and touches the nail holes, my Lord and my God. This type of language was associated by the Christians with Jesus Christ. That Diocletian should take it over was regarded by the Christian communities as an obvious usurpation of the position of God himself, and Diocletian, in their minds, would suffer for that. In the West, Constantius I, one of the badass generals of history and also the Augustus, he was the father of Constantine. He came to power and the persecutions ended with the resignation of Diocletian. Now, Constantius Chlorus also had to go north. He was basically hanging out in Gaul, keeping the peace of one of the richest portions of the empire, but also potentially one of the most rebellious. And the Picts north of Hadrian's Wall were revolting. Some Romans said they were always revolting, whether they were fighting against Romans or not. The lack of bathing among the Picts, I think, led to that little joke. But the Constantius goes north to fight in Britain. And by this time, Constantine, who had been largely with Diocletian in his youth, probably witnessed the burning of the cathedral in Nicomedia. Constantine had fled for his life, fearing that since he had not been appointed Caesar after the abdication of Diocletian, he thought he'd be moving up in the system, and he didn't move up. He thought, he would be targeted. So he fled and joined his dad in Gaul, and they both marched then into Britain to fight the Picts. This is there's a long and colorful history involved with all of this. So, Constantius and son, Constantine, are now in Britain. Constantius's first wife, the mother of Constantine, was a Christian from the province of Bithynia, and many of the Romans in Britain, or in Gaul, that area, but Britain is what I always think of because I go there a lot, were Christian. Note Irenaeus of Lyon as one of the examples of an early Gallican mission in that region. But the Celts, or whatever passes for Celts in that area, the Gauls, the Britons, seem to have quite a number of Christians among them. So Constantine, he had divorced or set aside, or Constantius had divorced or set aside Constantine's mother some years earlier, but the idea, this happened a lot with political marriages, but the idea was certainly he loved her, certainly he loved his son Constantine, as the story goes, and the Christianity of Constantine's mother probably had an effect on Constantine. When exactly she converted to Christianity, we don't know. It is reasonable, I think, to believe that she converted long before her son became emperor, and this influenced his thinking. I don't find Constantine ever, and you should know this about me, a particularly Christian or saintly person. As an Eastern Orthodox Christian, when I find the relics of Constantine and his mother Helen, which are often found together, bits of Constantine and bits of Helen, I always kiss Helen's relics and just kind of pass by Constantine. Constantine is, after all, a vicious bastard who murdered most of his own nuclear family as a way of ensuring they didn't pose a threat to his reign. Only converted to Christianity on his deathbed. In any case, I do think that Constantine and possibly Constantius were both influenced by the Christians around them to think this is a waste of time, persecuting Christians, waste of humanity as well. In the East, however, where Galerius had taken over for Diocletian, persecutions increased and intensified until the year 311. Galerius at that point had retired to his deathbed and issued an Edict of Toleration. The Christian interpretation of this was that Galerius feared for his life and had come to the realization that taking on the one true God was a bad move, and this led to him getting a nasty disease of the groin, where he had a large tumor in his groin that became a bleeding open wound in his groin. I'll let you picture this as you will. Eventually, worms infected the wound and ate through his belly, which had grown quite large because Galerius, although a tough general at one point in his life, had grown quite fat, and so he died eaten out from the inside by worms. Edict of Toleration aside, end of persecution of Christians aside, it didn't save his life. That's how the Christian historians record this. Persecutions were resumed under Maximinus. Boy, there's so much about the Tetrarchy I want to say, but with the knowledge that since this is not a Byzantine history course and it won't be on the test, you won't care. But it is an interesting and politically bizarre period of time. Constantius I died shortly after the successful campaign against the Picts, and his son, at one of the massive military encampments in what is now known as York in England, Constantine allied himself with Licinius, the Caesar of the East, to seize power from their two rivals. Boy, there's so much involved in this that I just really shouldn't talk about. Licinius couldn't field his own army. Technically, Licinius was supposed to be in control of the West, particularly Italy, but Maxentius, actually Constantine's brother-in-law after he set aside his first wife, Maxentius was in charge of Rome, and Licinius didn't have the army to take Rome. Well, Constantine said, heck, now that Dad's dead, I have the army. And Constantine at York in the year 306, when his father died in July, was proclaimed Augustus by the army, and particularly with the support of a German mercenary by the name of Crocus. Clever name, that. I'm not sure that it symbolizes a thing, but I just, can't help but picturing Crocus proclaiming Constantine, and I've got flowers in my mind. Crocus pushed for the proclamation of Constantine as Augustus. The army certainly backed it. Constantine was extremely popular with the most massive army in the Roman Empire, and that's going to lead to his success, which it did. Constantine, after he was proclaimed emperor, hung out in Gaul, kind of a wealthy and nice place to hang out, a century and a half anyway, after Irenaeus was there. It had civilized quite nicely, and didn't bother moving on Rome until the time was exactly right. And this was in the year 312. Time to move, time to gain real power along with Licinius. The nice thing is he's got a weak ally who is in desperate need of an army, so Constantine can call the shots. And indeed he does. In 313, after the Battle of Milvian Bridge, the Battle of Milvian Bridge was October 28, 312. I know you were concerned that I wasn't going to mention that. Constantine and Licinius agreed to issue a joint edict of toleration, or at least that's how the story goes. Again, the story is wrong. This goes down in history as the Edict of Milan. As Robert Louis Wilkin will tell you, if you're sitting at lunch with him at a conference, it was not an edict. In other words, there was no official proclamation legalizing Christianity. It wasn't a decree of the emperors. It was kind of a casual agreement at best between Constantine and Licinius, and it may or may not have happened in Mediolanum or Milan. By this time, Rome was a dive. It wasn't worth living in if you were emperor, so the seat of power in Italy was really Milan. There's so many debates about what went on at Milvian Bridge that I almost hate to go into it, but I have to, because this is where the mythology of Constantine really comes to a head. So 313, let's just set that aside for a moment. It wasn't an edict. It may or may not have been in Milan, but Licinius and Constantine do decide to stop persecuting Christians. That's about all you can say about that. When Constantine got south of the Alps, the real fighting began. Maxentius had holed himself up in Rome, probably a wise decision because you don't want to be running around all over if you're trying to make yourself emperor. And Constantine, by this time really the most powerful rebel in the entire Roman provinces, since he'd only been proclaimed Augustus by the army and not by anyone down south in a governmental position to do so, Constantine marches south of the Alps with some 90,000 infantry, as the story goes, and about 8,000 cavalry. Numbers like that are always suspect just because, for the simple reason that they are numbers. There's not a single number in all of history when it comes to troops that is that should be left unquestioned. In any case, the army was massive, and town after town fell to Constantine, more or less. Really, there was fighting involved, to be sure, but more or less without a fight. With an army like that, you've pretty well got a sense of that surrender is a mighty good military option when they're coming down on you, especially after they sack and destroy a town or two. Not every place felt that way, and there were some longer holdouts, but nothing that you would call a genuine siege. So in October 28th, 312, apparently Constantine is facing Rome. Maxentius had marched out to meet Constantine and lost badly, but had fallen back to Rome. There were two bridges across the Tiber that separated Constantine's army from Rome proper. And one of those bridges, for whatever reason, had been destroyed. Now, whether that was Maxentius' choice or not is a matter of debate, and I don't think historians who make a positive claim one way or another are probably wrong. How about that? Everybody's wrong. Let's just say that and move on. But a significant portion of Maxentius' army is trapped north of the river with one very narrow bridge to go across. It does make you wonder whether going north of the river was smart at all when you had a nice, defensible Rome to stay in. Constantine sweeps down, pins most of this army against the river. Maxentius dies trying to cross the river. His head's cut off of his body and sent around the empire, particularly to North Africa, as a message. Don't piss off Constantine. Now, in the mythology of Constantine, you have this bit with the vision, and I don't believe it. I don't believe it at all, just so you know. Supposedly on the eve of the battle, he has a vision in the sky and sees either a massive Cairo or possibly a cross, depending on how we translate the passage and whether we believe Eusebius of Caesarea at all, which I generally don't. Church historian and bishop though he was. Constantine was told in this vision that in this sign you will conquer, and so he put the sign of the Cairo, which I think it would make more sense anyway. He put the sign of the Cairo, meaning the sign symbolizing Christ, on the shields of his army and wound up winning. It makes for a good myth anyway, and Christians have been celebrating this myth now. It was 2013 last year, which means we had the 1700-year celebration of the Edict of Milan, and I spent most of last year telling people that that wasn't an edict. It probably didn't happen in Milan. Thank you, Robert Louis Wilkin. He corrupted my history for all time by hanging out with you too much. It wasn't an edict, and then telling folks that almost nothing you've heard about Constantine really stands the test of historical questioning. But that's where some of the mythology goes. I don't believe Constantine had anything more to do with Christianity than a certain sympathy for persecuted peoples. I think he was capable of that, and a sense that it was a total waste of resources to be killing people who weren't fighting back when you had plenty of people who were fighting back to kill. That's more Constantine's level of thinking. He is one of history's badasses, and he comes up way short of saint, I think, for that reason. Most emperors have to, or they wouldn't be emperors. This raises the question of the problem of forgiveness. Persecution did not significantly weaken the Christian movement directly, as we talked about in regard to Perpetua and Felicitas. It seems that Tertullian has a point. Persecutions actually drew attention to Christianity in such a way that the illegal movement grew when the persecutions occurred, which is why perhaps they didn't occur that often because they had a backlash effect that was counterproductive. However, persecution, particularly the later persecutions under Diocletian and his followers, did give rise to a series of debates which divided the Christian communities for about 3 centuries in total, from the 3rd century when Decius really began the first universal persecution, and for 3 centuries to follow. Is it okay? Is it okay to consciously reject the faith, and can you come back to the church once you've done so? Of course it's not okay to consciously reject the faith, but what are the rules for letting somebody who does so, who is offered the chance to sacrifice and does, or buys a certificate that allows him to pretend he sacrificed, what do you do with these people? Do you let them back in the church? So the heart of the question is what to do with those who consciously, after pledging to remain faithful to Christianity at their baptisms, committed acts which constituted a rejection of the faith. About this time, at the end of the 3rd century, you also have the habit increasing of not baptizing children. The idea being, here's your age of accountability, except it has nothing to do with that concept as it later occurs in Anabaptism. The idea was you don't condemn children to death. Christianity should be a conscious choice because there's a death penalty attached in this heated persecution. So at this point you do have a move toward only baptizing adults. But that's just by way of, pointing out what's going on with the baptism question, which has been dogging us for a couple centuries now. And also pointing out just what some of the implications of this severe persecution were. What do you do with those who actually sacrificed to the Roman gods? Should they be let back into the church? After all, they basically were traitors to their religion. They left Christianity and sacrificed to the gods. What about those who were not quite as guilty? They purchased documents that said they sacrificed, the libelli. That's where we get our word libel, by the way. What do you do with the libelli, the people who, since the time of Decius, found it easy enough to avoid persecution by simply saying, okay, we did sacrifice, and then keeping that around for family protection? What about those who were being tortured and under the strains of torture betrayed their fellow Christians? You can see there are starting, even among the most hardline folks, there are going to be gray areas here. Sacrificing to the Roman gods, forget you. You turned your back on the church. Don't expect to be let in the back in the door any time soon. But the libelli? Well, after all, you didn't actually sacrifice, but you were scared for your family, which isn't good. You shouldn't deny the faith. But what about those who are being, branded with red-hot irons or having their body parts slowly cut off and give away the names of other people who are also Christians under that type of torture? Well, ideally, true martyrs in whom Christ is suffering and who do not give in to the temptations of the weakness of the flesh would never do that. As we saw with Perpetua and Felicitas, they stand up under such torture. But these shades of gray are developing. And the question isn't here, is what they did okay? None of this is okay. Not even betraying your fellow Christians when you're having your fingers and toes slowly cut off. That's not okay either. The question is, do you let them back into the church? What about those who weren't being tortured? And this is yet a more mild thing, but in order to avoid other people being hurt, perhaps children being killed, they hand over the books. They hand over the books of the liturgy, they hand over the books of Christian writers, and they hand over the scriptures. These people are called the traditori, but from which we get our word traitor. So we get our word libel and our word traitor from this period in history when Christians are tempted to hand things over or to cave in rather than stand up for their own faith. Interesting how this affects our language, is it not? These people, would you allow somebody to burn the sacred books of Christianity if it would save the life of some children in the parish? Well, that seems pretty reasonable to the way we think today. Nevertheless, they betrayed the faith. They were traitors. What about those who did none of the above but simply renounced Christianity before the authorities but stopped before they sacrificed or didn't have anything else going against them? They simply said the wrong thing in a period of weakness. Should such people be readmitted to the community in good standing? What about waiting for a period of penitence? This seems to have been the more popular route. Give them time to demonstrate their loyalty again. What about those who were confessors, telling them that they were forgiven and could re-enter the church? The confessors, after all, were those who had stood fast, who had rejected the chance to cave in, who were willing to die for the faith, many of whom had been tortured and crippled as their martyrdoms were supposed to be carried out, but for one reason or another, but in the Christian's mind, by the grace of God, these people survived their own martyrdoms. Now, these people have a special relationship with Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit preserved them all the way through their martyrdom. They survived. They are specially marked and gifted people. If these people say, wait, over here Maximus betrayed the faith by handing over books, but he should be readmitted to the community now that he is heartily sorry for betraying the faith. Could the forgiveness of true confessors absolve them of their sins? The confessors had something that nobody else did. They'd actually faced up to their own martyrdoms and managed to live. All of these questions and more represents the range of opinions regarding the lapsed, and it's a sticky and problematic question. You may think, because you have certain images of Christianity after the last 1400 years or so, you may think that it's simple. You know, that God forgives sins. That's what God does. And yet, these people had betrayed the very Holy Spirit, had betrayed the very faith to which they were called. It was not such a simple question then. The reason it seems simple to you now, my listening audience and history of Christianity, is because of the way the solution was found then. Understandably, all of these options were not seen as equally severe. Some would argue that actual sacrifice was one thing, that after all is betraying Christianity to worship another god. Buying a certificate is another level, and some argued that books were merely books and could be copied again. On the other hand, there were plenty of people, especially in North Africa, where the persecution had been particularly severe in mid-century under Decius. There were plenty of people who said, we've seen persecutions and we've seen traitors. They argued that turning your back on the faith was always an action which excluded you from the community and should do so permanently. You were to be cast on the mercy of God and not be admitted back to the Eucharist. If God wants to save you, that's God's business. The most radical of these, the Donatists of the early 4th century, argued that even the sacraments of those priests who were in a tradition where the leaders had lapsed were invalid. So let's say you, in, say, the year 325, become a bishop, if you're a guy, or you're a bishop's wife, because they still had married bishops at this time, some of them. Let's say you have never betrayed the faith, but one of the bishops who ordained you, one of the bishops who made you a bishop, or made your husband a bishop if you want to be as equal as we can be in a patriarchal society, one of those bishops had been readmitted to the church after a period of repentance, or had ordained you before he lapsed. The Donatists would say that your ordination and your ministry is invalid because you stand in the line of a traitor. You stand in the line of somebody who betrayed the faith. You are in a tradition where the leaders had betrayed the faith. In other words, the Donatists are a bunch of really hardline legalists when it comes to the problem of forgiveness. Your sacraments as a priest, bishop, or deacon, your service, are not valid. They don't work because you come from a tradition where somebody in your tradition betrayed the faith. Again, this seems like a really extreme position to us today. I would suggest that we think of this as an extreme position because our way of thinking about Christianity as a religion of forgiveness has been shaped by how this question was answered in the 4th and 5th centuries. The debate was especially intense because although forgiveness was a key part of Christianity, there were plenty of authoritative texts from the scriptures themselves, in addition to the clear statements of the fathers such as the Shepherd of Hermas, which, if read in a certain way, suggested that those who consciously rejected the faith, either in words or in actions which denied the essence of Christianity by committing murder, adultery, etc., had shown their true colors and made their final choice, and were not to be let back into the community. If God wants to save them somehow, that's God's business, not the community's. They should not be let back in. You have that bit that, as I recall, Nicole asked about in this particular iteration of the class, in Mark, where we're talking about the unforgivable sin, the sin against the Holy Spirit, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. And if you blaspheme against the gift of the Spirit, have you committed a sin for which you should not be readmitted to the church, because Jesus said that sin will not be forgiven. We went over that a bit in the class where that came up. If you have further questions on it, we can go over it from a different angle. That's a sticky verse, and you can see how it can be interpreted different ways when you get into it. The persecutions merely brought the problem, which arises from the reading of these texts themselves, to a head. After the legalization of Christianity, the conflict came to be known as the Donatist controversy, after the most vocal group of those arguing against readmission of the lapsed, followers of Donatus. Opponents of the Donatists were in the majority, arguing that Christ had always made exceptions and that one's later behavior should count as much as moments of weakness in making such judgments. This was a religion of forgiveness, and the majority came to that conclusion rather quickly. Two keys to returning to the church were the now time-honored practices of confession, which could occur before the entire community, and usually did in the early church, instead of speaking into the ear of a priest, as is done today in the Roman Catholic or Orthodox traditions, or Lutheran traditions where that's practiced. You would stand before the entire community and confess your sins, confess what you had done. Boy, that's social control for you. And that concept of confession, and certainly the confession of somebody who had lapsed, would be done before the entire community or before an actual confessor, by which I mean the people who had suffered and survived martyrdom. And then there was also a period of penance in which the lapsed were given a second chance to demonstrate their devotion to the faith. In effect, they became like catechumens again, and had to work through and demonstrate with their lives and their actions that they were committed to Christianity. And then they could be let back in. A crucial point in this controversy came when the Emperor Constantine demanded that the clergy meet in local councils. In this case, the councils that come into your textbook are Rome and Arles, in what we now think of as France, to settle the issue. This is significant because this is the first time that an emperor calls a council to settle a dispute between the newly legalized Christians. The rulings at both Rome and Arles went heavily against the Donatists, but the Donatists remained a schism until the Germanic invasions, or the, folk migrations of the German tribes, or the outreach program, since we're making a euphemism out of Germans behaving badly, the outreach program of the Goths managed to wipe out the rival churches of the Donatists. One of the downsides of the Donatists is that their interest in martyrdom led them not only to condemn those who fled martyrdom, but it led them to seek out martyrdom actively. Now that's just not the best policy for maintaining your movement in a period of time where vicious Germans are more than willing to cut you down if you rush upon them. So they remained out there, and it remained a rival church throughout the 4th and into the 5th century. The concept of the council determining the official position of the church in the empire, however, and the idea that such a council could be called by an emperor in order to settle annoying and embarrassing disputes among his newly legalized citizens, or subjects anyway, this had been established. So the idea of the council, the idea of the emperor calling a council, this is established. That's an important point, because when Martin Luther, way down in the 16th century, believes that problems in the church need to be addressed, he suggests the council needs to be called by the emperor, as it was done in ancient days.